Back in 1878, Dodge City was a veritable who's who of the Wild West. Not only did you have Bat Masterson as the county sheriff, along with the legendary Charlie Bassett as the town marshal, but you also had a young lawman by the name of Wyatt Earp serving as Bassett's second in command. Not to mention other notable characters like Bill Tillman, J.J. Webb, Mysterious Dave Mather, and even a dentist/gambler known as Doc Holliday. In fact, it's there in Dodge, either during the spring or summer of 1878, where Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday formed a friendship that would last a lifetime. Story goes that Earp found himself surrounded one evening by a gang of desperados. Outnumbered and with no way out, Wyatt had no choice but to stand his ground come what may. And then, just as things seemed dire, here comes Holliday, running out of saloon, pistols in each hand, and holding the ne'er-do-wells at bay as Wyatt placed him under arrest. Now, even though Doc and Wyatt had first become acquainted down in Texas months prior, according to Earp, it was, quote, because of this episode that I became the friend of Doc Holliday ever after, end of quote. There are additional stories regarding Holliday's time there in Dodge, claiming that he was everything from a dangerous drunk to a con artist. But so far as the official records are concerned, it does appear as if he kept a relatively low profile. This was even confirmed by Bat Masterson later on, when he wrote that Holliday stayed out of trouble the entire time he was in Dodge. That said, he did place an ad in the Dodge City Times advertising his services as a dentist. How much dentistry he actually accomplished is unknown, given all of his drinking and gambling, but he was said to have carried what was described as a pocket dental office. Just sort of a small kit of basic tools that he hauled around in a case. Kinda makes me wonder if the stories are true about him yanking teeth while playing poker. But what did Doc Holliday get up to after Dodge City? How'd he and Earp wind up together in Tombstone taking on the Cochise County Cowboys? And just how big was his girlfriend's nose anyway? Join me today as we discuss all of that and more, including Holliday's time in Vegas. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! Now, eventually, Doc and his gal pal, Kate Elder, would follow the railroad west to Trinidad, Colorado, a town that a journalist once described as having all of the, quote, numerous necessary evils you always find in a live, wide-awake, get-up town. In other words, there were plenty of saloons and gambling joints for Doc to ply his trade. By the way, this is part 2 in an ongoing series on Doc Holliday. If you'd like to check out part 1, I do have a link down below. We discuss everything from Doc's early childhood, his romance with his cousin, and even his first gunfight down in Texas. Pretty much everything up until he arrived in Dodge City during the spring or early summer of 1878. Now, like I said, Holliday and Kate would head west to Trinidad later on that fall, but they would not remain long. Possibly on account of Doc shooting a man known as Kid Colton, or Kid Dalton. Not a lot of details on this. If I'm not mistaken, the only sources are Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, neither of whom could agree on the guy's name. But according to Masterson, Doc shot him over a, quote, very trivial matter. After which he and Kate moved on yet again, this time about 130 miles south to Las Vegas, New Mexico. Or to be more precise, the Montezuma Hot Springs, just north of Las Vegas. Remember, there wasn't a cure for tuberculosis back in those days, and Doc certainly wasn't getting no better. In fact, by the time they left Trinidad, he was in pretty rough shape, hence the hot springs. The hot springs, of course, were thought to have curative effects on various ailments, including tuberculosis. Hell, this one in particular, north of Vegas, even had something known as the Lungers Club. Not only that, but they even had a motto. Cure our maladies, we tuberculars unite. Coughing and wheezing, we continue the fight. For rest and recuperations, in hot springs we soak. For if we can't fuck our cousins, then we might as well croak. Okay, so I did make up that last part, but the rest is true. There really was a Lungers Club in Vegas, and that really was their motto, minus the part about screwing their cousins. Sorry, I couldn't resist. A little throwback to earlier in the series when we discussed Doc's relationship with his cousin Maddie. But yeah, in all seriousness, these hot springs really didn't offer up much of a remedy for tuberculosis. Obviously, right? I mean, there was nothing magical about the water. That said, all the heat and rest and dry air did get Doc to feeling a little better. And once he was able, he and Kate moved into Las Vegas proper. It's there where Holliday would once again open up a dental practice, as well as resume the life of a gambler. Only problem was the damn territorial government had recently issued a law prohibiting gambling, and that being the case, Doc would be arrested a total of 3 times over the next 6 months. twice for gambling, and once for carrying a pistol. Now, one of the things that you'll often hear about Holliday is that he left Vegas either during the spring or summer of 1879 in order to help out Bat Masterson recruit some gunfighters for Colorado's Royal Gorge War. This is a conflict we've discussed previously here on the show, and I will be returning to it in the future when I cover Masterson. But long story short, there's really no evidence whatsoever that Holliday was involved. Masterson himself never even once mentioned Doc helping to recruit the fighters, and the only source that I'm aware of for Holliday's participation comes from vaudeville actor Eddie Foy. He wrote about it in his 1928 autobiography and claimed that Doc tried to recruit him, but then again, Foy was known to stretch the truth. In all reality, it looks as if Doc remained there in the vicinity of Las Vegas. I know at one point he traveled north to Otero, which, if I'm not mistaken, is now the town of Raton, New Mexico, and it's there where he was alleged to have killed a man, but once again, there's nothing in the way of evidence proving as much. According to historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "While in Otero, Doc may or may not have killed a man in self-defense. Probably not," end of quote. Now, on July 19th, 1879, Doc would open up his very own saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico, which coincidentally is also the same day that he killed a ne'er-do-well by the name of Mike Gordon. Apparently, Gordon had been getting his drink on over in Doc's joint during the grand opening and tried talking one of the sporting gals into leaving with him. And when she refused, Gordon stepped outside, pulled out his gun, and started firing directly into the saloon. What happened next is a bit chaotic, and details do differ, depending on your sources, but we do know that Holliday managed to step outside and put a bullet straight into Gordon's chest. There was a coroner's inquest, but I guess Gordon wasn't all that well liked, and nobody was willing to identify Doc as the shooter, so he got off scot-free. Now, remember earlier when I said that Dodge City was sort of a who's who when it came to the Old West? Well, the same thing also applies to Las Vegas, New Mexico. Not only did you have a lot of the same guys who had been in Dodge, like J.J. Webb, Rudaball, and Dave Mather, but you also had Hoodoo Brown, Clay Allison. Eventually, Billy the Kid would start hanging out there. Hell, even Jesse James was rumored to have visited Vegas. And at some point in late fall or early winter of 1879, so did Wyatt Earp. Just not for very long. You see, Wyatt had resigned his position in Dodge City the previous September and was looking to try his luck down in the new boomtown of Tombstone. According to historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "At Las Vegas came the cheerful reunion between Wyatt and Doc. Kate Elder, though, found nothing cheerful about it. She was jealous of anything or anyone she saw as competition for Doc's attentions. She went into a rage when she once found another woman with Doc. Brandishing a big knife, Kate threatened to rip her open. Doc's gal never threatened Wyatt, but she didn't like him, and she especially didn't like the strong influence he held over her lover. And Kate blamed Wyatt for all the subsequent trouble she had with Doc. I loved Doc and thought the world of him," she said decades later, "and he was always kind to me until he got mixed up with the Earps. This reunion," she said, "meant the end of the happiness we had enjoyed." End of quote. And yeah, apparently Wyatt really did have somewhat of a strong influence on Holliday, as he soon convinced him to tag along to Arizona. And Kate, her hatred of Wyatt notwithstanding, decided to join him. The group ended up stopping over at Prescott, where Wyatt's brother Virgil was living, but apparently old Doc didn't give much of a first impression to Virgil's wife. She would later recall, quote, "Wyatt kind of casually introduced him to us as a dentist. Right away, I said, 'How'd you like to yank out a loose tooth of mine?' He gave me a nasty look and said, 'Keep your baby teeth in your mouth where they belong. I've got no use for 'em.' Wyatt roared like it was a big joke." End of quote. I like that. Now, Wyatt and Virgil would pull out for Tombstone just a few weeks later, but Doc and Kate chose to remain behind in Prescott, most likely at Kate's urgings. But then again, the area was ripe for the picking. In fact, there was even a part of town known as Whiskey Row. It catered not only to prospectors, but also soldiers from nearby Fort Whipple. For a seasoned gambler like Holliday, it must have been like shooting fish in a barrel. That said, he would end up heading back to Vegas in late February of 1880 to get one of his old gambling charges dismissed. And since he was already in town, he decided to go ahead and kill a man by the name of Charles Wright. Now, bear with me for a moment, as this does get a little confusing, but supposedly Doc and Wright had known one another back in Dodge City, where, per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, Wright had a shady reputation. Mr. Roberts also alleges that Wright was related to Dodge City businessman Robert M. Wright, same old boy who would try to get Clay Allison to kill Wyatt Earp. And when money came up missing from Robert's store, Charlie falsely accused Doc of being the culprit. I'm not really sure how much evidence we have to support any of these claims, but if that's true, it could at least somewhat explain Holliday's actions there in Vegas. I guess Doc heard that Wright was in town, working as a bartender, so he made it a point to look him up. And per an eyewitness, quote, Doc entered the saloon with a cocked revolver in his hand and began hostilities at once, without previously making his presence known. Wright was in the act of serving some thirsty customers, but recognizing his old enemy from Dodge City, he ducked behind the bar just in time, while the customers ducked to the floor. Wright quickly emerged with a six-shooter and a duel began in dead earnest, many shots being exchanged at short distance without effect. End of quote. Now, eventually one of Doc's bullets would hit pay dirt, and Wright dropped to the floor in what historian Mark Lee Gardner described as a lifeless heap. Meanwhile, Holliday just casually stepped outside and went about his business. Turns out Wright wasn't dead, though. Doc's bullet had merely grazed the skin near his spine, causing a temporary case of paralysis. And by later on that day, he was back on his feet tending bar. By the way, this is just a fun little side note, but Charlie Wright had also, allegedly, seen action during the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. In fact, the guy I mentioned a moment ago, Robert Wright, was part owner of Rath's store, where several of the defenders were holed up. Skip ahead to Fort Worth in 1890, and Wright narrowly avoided death yet again when he got into a gunfight with Luke Short. And although both men were wounded, they would survive. Which is crazy to think about. Not only did Charlie Wright survive the Kiowa and Comanche, but he also survived gunfights with two of the deadliest gunslingers of the Old West. Not only that, but he outlived both of them, dying of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1907. Now, this all comes with a very, very big asterisk. I feel like it's my duty to point out that much of what you just heard is pure speculation. We don't know for sure that the Las Vegas Charlie was the same Charlie who shot Luke Short. We also don't know for certain whether he was related to Robert Wright, or even if the Charlie who died in 1907 was the same guy who fought at Adobe Walls. And since we're splitting hairs, we also don't know for certain that Doc Holliday tried to kill him. You see that whole story about Doc going into the saloon, guns ablazing and shooting Wright? That comes from just one source, a book titled My Life on the Frontier by Miguel Otero, which was published over a half a century after the fact. And I hate to sound like that guy, the well, actually kind of guy, but this is a big theme throughout Holliday's story. There's just so many legends and tall tales surrounding this guy, but when you really get down to it, many of his alleged exploits are completely lacking when it comes to credible sources. He may have shot Wright exactly as Otero claimed, but then again, it's also possible that Otero just fabricated the entire incident. As of this recording, we really don't have enough evidence. Either way, Doc would head back to Prescott shortly thereafter and have his likeness taken by photographer Daniel Mitchell. Now, by the way, speaking of photographs, believe it or not, there are only 2 images of Holliday as an adult that are provably authentic. There's the one from when he graduated dental school, and then there's this most recent photo that was taken at Prescott. All the others that you see online are either of unknown provenance or just verified fakes. I actually have an entire video about this on YouTube if you'd like to learn more. I think it's titled, This Is Not Doc Holliday, but the one taken there in Prescott is definitely the real deal. And yeah, by mid-September of 1880 is when Doc finally made the move to Tombstone. Turns out things had changed quite a bit since he and Wyatt had last seen one another. You see, Wyatt and his brother Virgil had initially planned on starting their own stagecoach business. Only problem is there was already a couple of stage companies there in Tombstone, so Wyatt instead took a job riding shotgun for Wells Fargo, as Virgil settled in as a deputy U.S. Marshal. In fact, it was Virgil's capacity as Marshal that saw the first clash between the Earps and the Cowboys. Apparently, he had led a posse, including brothers Wyatt and Morgan, after some stolen army mules which they found in the possession of the McLaury brothers, Tom and Frank. Now, in time, this feud between them and the Cowboys would greatly intensify. And don't worry, we'll get to that here shortly. But it's worth noting that Wyatt Earp was not yet an official lawman. At least not when he had that run-in with the McLaurys. He was just working for Wells Fargo, doing a little bit of speculation and a whole hell of a lot of gambling. That said, by the time Doc arrived, Wyatt had already accepted a position as deputy sheriff for Pima County. Speaking of Doc, he wasn't even in Tombstone for a full month before he got arrested. He and another gambler by the name of Johnny Tyler, that's right, the madcap Johnny Tyler, began quarreling at the Oriental Saloon on the night of October 10th. Things escalated quickly, and just as Doc and Tyler were about to go for their guns, a crowd rushed in to separate them. Pistols were confiscated, and the saloon's manager, a guy by the name of Milt Joyce, ordered Tyler to get the hell out. Joyce then turned his ire on Doc and started berating him for causing trouble. I guess Holliday didn't like such loose talk, so he started giving it right back. Or at least he did until Joyce, a former blacksmith, went ahead and physically threw Doc out the front door. He returned just moments later, demanding his gun, but Joyce told him to kick rocks. Probably not the smartest of choices, as Doc did show back up later on that night with a borrowed pistol, which he used to shoot Joyce in the hand. This is actually very similar to that story of him shooting Charlie Wright. In both accounts, Doc simply stepped inside and commenced to shooting. He would actually fire a total of 3 shots before Joyce managed to rush in and disarm him. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, Virgil Earp arrested Doc and escorted him from the saloon. When Doc was finally able to appear before the Justice of the Peace, 4 witnesses curiously failed to appear. A charge of attempted murder was dropped, and Doc pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of assault and battery. He got off with a fine plus court costs. Milt Joyce, however, came very close to losing his hand. The gunshot wound eventually healed, but the scar was a bitter reminder that Doc Holliday had tried to kill him. And the fact that Holliday and the Earps were tight didn't make Joyce think too kindly of the Earps either. End of quote. So there you have it. Once again, Doc not exactly making a great first impression. Now, just a couple weeks later is when cowboy leader Curly Bill Brocius shot and killed Tombstone Marshal Fred White. And by the way, if it seems like I'm sort of glossing over certain events from Tombstone, don't worry, because we will be starting a series on Wyatt Earp very soon, at which time I will go way more in depth. Long story short, though, there was a group of rustlers there in Pima County known as the Cowboys. I spoke about these guys recently in the Old Man Clanton episode, but they were essentially just a loose confederation of ranchers and, in many cases, outright bandits who routinely joined forces to steal cattle and rob stagecoaches. Not only did they have a ready market for stolen beef there in Tombstone with all the hungry prospectors, but they also sold cattle to the reservation over at San Carlos. Curly Bill Brocius was one of the leaders, but you also had the McLaury brothers, you had the notorious Johnny Ringo, Pony Dill, Billy the Kid Claiborne, Frank Stillwell, Sherman McMaster, Michael Rourke, also known as Johnny Behind the Deuce, and of course the infamous Clanton brothers, Ike, Phineas, and Billy. The estimates vary as to their numbers, but according to Virgil Earp, there were around 200 of them. And believe it or not, as violent as the Cowboys were, they were not universally hated. In fact, they even had quite a few allies there in Tombstone. Once again, according to Wyatt's brother Virgil, the Cowboys spent money, quote, free as water in the saloons, dance houses, or faro banks. And this is one reason why they have so many friends in town. All that large class of degraded characters who gather the crumbs of such carouses stand ready to assist them out of any trouble or into any pain, rascality. The saloons and gambling houses, into whose treasuries most of the money is ultimately turned, receive them cordially and must be called warm friends of the Cowboys. A good many of the merchants fear to express themselves against the criminal element because they want to keep the patronage of the Cowboys' friends. And the result is that when any conflict between officers and cattle thieves or stage robbers occurs, followed by shootings around town, most of the expression of opinion comes from the desperado class and their friends. And the men who should speak the loudest and the most decisively to correct the condition of affairs are generally the quietest. End of quote. And yeah, turns out it wasn't just the saloon owners who were being all buddy-buddy with the Cowboys. Apparently, a few of the local politicians also realized they constituted a large voting bloc and likewise solicited their approval. Hell, when Pima County Sheriff Charles Scheibel, or Scheibel, run for re-election in November of 1880, it was the Cowboys who helped him win by stuffing the ballots. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to sort of set the scene real quick and give you a bit of a backstory on these various players there in Tombstone. Suffice it to say, there was a lot going on. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was on October 28th, 1880, when Curly Bill Brocius shot Marshall White. And contrary to what you may have seen in some of the movies, this was an accidental killing. They were even able to prove in court later on that the revolver had a malfunction, allowing it to fire on half cock. It's also worth noting that Marshall White was only like 30 or 31 years old at the time of his death, as opposed to actor Harry Carey Jr., who was in his 70s when he portrayed White in the movie Tombstone. But yeah, like I said, this was an accident, and despite Brocious otherwise being a complete asshole, charges were eventually dropped. Now, Wyatt Earp would eventually quit his job as deputy sheriff out of protest following that rigged election of Sheriff Scheibel or Scheibel or however the hell you pronounce this guy's name. Wyatt then thought about running for sheriff of the newly formed Cochise County where Tombstone was, but rather than risk losing to his rival, Johnny Behan, the pair instead made a deal. If Wyatt would drop out of the race, Behan would appoint him as under sheriff. And then just to sweeten the pot, Behan agreed to split the tax revenue. You see, back in those days, one of the main responsibilities as a sheriff was to collect taxes. And in a lot of places, the sheriff was able to keep a portion of the revenue. This is what they used to pay their deputies and various other expenses. Just to give you an idea, in the year 1882, the sheriff's office there in Cochise County collected over $24,000 in taxes. I guess Wyatt felt like it would be a pretty lucrative deal, so he agreed. The only thing is, when Behan received the appointment, he completely reneged on the offer. And then when Wyatt and Virgil helped apprehend a stagecoach robber, Behan refused to reimburse him on account of not officially swearing him in as deputies. So needless to say, there was no love lost there in Tombstone between the Earps and the Cowboys and Sheriff Behan. Not to mention guys like Milt Joyce. As for Doc Holliday, he too was staying busy. He dabbled in a few mining properties as well as water rights, and even ran a faro bank over at the Alhambra Saloon. He also reunited with his lady love, Big Nose Kate. In fact, it was likely an argument with Kate that caused him to get arrested yet again on March 10th, 1881. Per the Daily Epitaph, quote, "Noted gambler Doc Holliday had a row with his paramour, Kate Elder, yesterday of an evening. The pair had been quarreling over someone whom Kate referred to as that whore cousin of yours. Mr. Holliday responded by saying, 'Don't you ever talk about my sweet Maddie like that ever again, or you're going to get it. Sure, she's my cousin, and yes, I'm aware of how weird that is, but hey, that ass just won't quit. And besides, when you turn the lights off, you can barely even tell that we're related.'" End of quote. And no, I did just make that up. As far as I'm aware, this fight had absolutely nothing to do with Doc's cousin Maddie, who we will be discussing more of later. In all reality, the Daily Epitaph reported the following, quote, "A man about town named John Doc, last night, while under the influence of too much family disturber, grew noisy and disorderly, and officers Ramsey and Kirkpatrick proceeded forthwith to take him in. While that transaction was in progress, the inevitable gun made its appearance, and in the melee was somehow discharged, the shot fortunately striking no one. The shootist was taken before Judge Wallace, and when that official got through with Doc, the latter was $25 poorer." End of quote. So yeah, apparently Holliday had gotten his load on and started fighting with Kate. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but she had initially chosen not to come with him to Tombstone. And when she finally showed up, she was still jealous over his relationship with Wyatt Earp. Which, in all fairness, this was not just a woman's intuition. By all accounts, Holliday really was fully devoted to Wyatt. Bat Masterson would even describe Doc as having his whole heart and soul wrapped up in Wyatt Earp, and that he was always ready to stake his life in defense of any cause in which Wyatt was interested. And according to Virgil Earp, quote, "Outside of us boys, I don't think he had a friend in the territory. He was a slender, sickly feller, but whenever a stage was robbed or a row started and help was needed, Doc was one of the first to saddle his horse and report for duty." You know, I'm probably not alone in this, but one of my favorite quotes from Tombstone is when Turkey Creek Jack Johnson asked Doc, "Why do you do it?" In other words, why are you getting yourself involved in all this, riding around and getting shot at when you're clearly suffering from tuberculosis? Why not just stay in bed and relax? And what does Holliday say in response? "Because Wyatt Earp is my friend." Prompting Johnson to state, "Well, hell, I got lots of friends." To which Doc replied, I don't. And yes, I do know that's just a Hollywood script, but it's still a very powerful statement, especially for a man like Doc Holliday who didn't necessarily fit in with the rest of society. If you're a guy like Doc and you find that one friend, the one who accepts you for who and what you are, warts and all, well, that's someone you'll die for. And I reckon Holliday felt that way about Wyatt Earp. That said, there was another guy there in Tombstone who Doc was friends with, a dope fiend and fellow lunger by the name of Bill Leonard. And that's what we'll be discussing next week, as well as Leonard's role in the Benson stage robbery, which, as fate would have it, would eventually lead to the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, which we will also be discussing in full. Thank you so much for joining me. Like I said earlier, this is part 2 in an ongoing series on Doc Holliday. There's a link down below for part 1, and part 3 will be headed your way next Wednesday. In the meantime, don't go shooting at no bartenders, okay? Don't pick a fight with your girlfriend just because she's not as hot as your cousin. And whatever you do, just be nice. I think the world would be a better place if we were all just nicer to one another. All right, till next time, adios.